Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. It is Free for All Friday. Talk about anything that's on your mind to talk about today. Looking again at this story here in Mississippi where Michael Bloomberg, the liberal mayor of New York, gave $250,000 to the Thad Cochran campaign. And the Cochran campaign, this isn't Senator Cochran's fault. I'm not blaming this on him. But the people around him tried to conceal this. They apparently either ignored or violated certain reporting requirements to divulge the source of this campaign and this collateralized loan. So once again, an indication of the lengths to which the GOP establishment is prepared to go in order to keep their guy in power. And I guess the other thing that kind of illustrates is the danger that Chris McDaniel represents to the GOP establishment. I mean, especially after what happened to Eric Cantor in Virginia, I think the GOP establishment is freaked. They are completely wigged out. And Senator McDaniel represents the kind of threat to the ruling class Republicans that Dave Bratt represented to them. And they saw what happened in Virginia. And I'm not saying all this stuff that's happened that we're talking about today just happened since Tuesday. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that McDaniel represents exactly the same kind of threat to the establishment that Dave Bratt represents. And so I think the GOP establishment now, they are truly wigged out because I think they feel the ground is kind of shifting beneath their feet, and I don't think they know exactly quite what to do about that. Now, let's see if I've got any let's see if we can grab a soundbite on this Iraq thing, if we can. Let's play clip number 3. This is Eric Biden. This is a flashback talking about Iraq. Remember President Obama, and it turns out that Hillary Clinton, a big-time promoter of this, Hillary Clinton was one of the biggest boosters of getting all of our troops out of Iraq. She defended it after it happened in 2011. And here is Joe Biden, clip number 3, talking about the historical significance of pulling our troops out of Iraq.
I am very optimistic about Iraq. I think it's going to be one of the great achievements of this administration. You're going to see 90,000 American troops come marching home by the end of the summer. You're going to see a stable government in Iraq that is actually moving toward a representative government. I've been there 17 times now. I go about every 3 months. I know every one of the major players and all the segments of that society. It's impressed me. I've been impressed how they have been deciding to use the political process rather than guns to settle their differences.
Well, I guess those days are gone. That was Joe Biden on with Larry King, using diplomacy and negotiation rather than guns to settle their differences. Well, they're not using guns, just guns, Vice President Biden, to settle their differences. They're using knives and machetes and swords and cutting people's heads off. Now, here's John Carl, clip number 4. John Carl, ABC News, talking to Jay Carney. Poor guy. I don't know what he's still doing. It's like they've lashed him to the mast, and he's just being pummeled by the waves. Poor Jay Carney. He wants out of there so bad, and he's still stuck there handling some of these press conferences. So John Carl says, look, I just played you that sound by Joe Biden. This is supposed to be one of his greatest achievements. And this is John Carl's question, for Jay Carney, is this, in fact, one of the great achievements of the Obama administration? Let's listen.
Senior officials in this White House have repeatedly over the years, and as recently as Tuesday, described as the president's top foreign policy accomplishments ending the war in Iraq and decimating and destroying core al-Qaeda. Given what we're seeing now in Iraq, can you still claim those as 2 of your signature achievements?
There is no question that the president pledged to end the war in Iraq, and he did. And that was...
There's no war in Iraq right now?
U.S. combat mission in Iraq. What is also the case, and what the president made clear as we wound down the war in Iraq, is that we need to be a good partner to the government in Iraq and provide the assistance that we can at their request to help them meet their security challenges.
And we heard this morning, President Obama said that's not going to include any boots on the ground. We're not going to give you any help. You are on your own. You've got to figure this out. You've got to solve it for yourselves. You're not going to get any help from the United States military. So there's another promise that President Obama made, this time to the leadership of Iraq. Hey, you need us. We will be there. Turns out that's absolutely not the case. Not going to get any kind of military help from the U.S. whatsoever. So not only is not only are our own civilians not getting any help from the military, neither is the government that we set up and left behind. Nobody now any longer is even pretending that this represents any sort of achievement whatsoever on the part of President Obama. And by the way, when President Obama said we are not going to send the military into Iraq, that's the first decision that President Obama has ever made that I agree with. The first thing he's ever said that I agree with. I just do not think we should expend one more American soldier in Iraq. I don't think we should spend one more dollar in Iraq. The only money we ought to spend, the only use we ought to make of the military right now is to get our people out of there, get them to safety, and leave that God-forsaken land to the Sunnis and the Shiites. Let them go to war with each other. And as Sarah Palin said, we just have to let Allah sort the whole thing out. And I believe we just stay out of there. If al-Qaeda takes over, and by the way, Iran's moving in, because Iran's government is the same brand of Islam as the government in Iraq right now. So Iran wants to prop up the existing government. They don't like al-Qaeda any more than anybody else does. Al-Qaeda doesn't like them anymore. No Muslims in the Middle East like Iran. They hate Iran. It's racial in part. They're Persians and the rest of them are Arabs. So you could have this possibility of this Iraqi-Iranian coalition forming against Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would be the ones that would have the biggest problem with some kind of an alliance between Iran and Iraq. Now, the government in Iraq right now is a minority group. They're the Sunnis. The majority of the country is Shia. So they're governing in the minority, but it's the same brand of Islam that governs Iran. So Iran is sending resources to help prop up this government in Iraq that's under assault, and that government being backed by other forces in the Middle East, probably by Saudi Arabia. Anyway, here's Jack Keane. Then we'll go to the phones. Clip number 5. Jack Keane on with Megyn Kelly. Talking about Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden, rather, his plans for a global, not a global caliphate, but an Islamic caliphate that would start right there in the region occupied by Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Let's listen.
Eyewitnesses say when this group swept into Mosul, 500,000 people ran in terror, including the Iraqi soldiers that we paid to train. This is the third major city this group has taken over in recent weeks. First it was Fallujah, then Mosul, now Tikrit. Tonight we believe they control all of this territory, and they are nowhere near done. One of the generals who warned that leaving this country too soon and with no residual forces in place would result in, quote, absolute disaster is my next guest. 4-star general and former Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General Jack Keane. General, thank you so much for being here.
Glad to be here.
And the question I have for you tonight is the vision that Osama bin Laden had of a caliphate, of an Islamic state where they would live amongst themselves and plan jihad against the West, coming to fruition as we see that map expand.
That's absolutely what's happening, Megan. This has been a 30-year intellectual drive for them to dominate and control Muslim lands, and this is forming right in front of us. It begins east of Aleppo in Syria and moves all the way to the Syrian border. Not everything, but a lot of territory and a lot of towns. And then northern Iraq and western Iraq, and closing in on the capital city of some 7 million people. This caliphate exists, and it will be the most menacing thing in the Middle East if unattended.
So the most menacing thing in the Middle East, and those that have called, I've got something else I want to do before the end of this hour. I need to do it now. So hang on. We'll take phone calls coming right out of the news break. I promise that's the first thing we'll do after the news break is go right to the phones. But we see the situation in Iraq. I've talked about it before. I want to refer to a column written by Kevin Williamson this morning about what he thinks we need to do with regard to Iraq. And here's what he says. Our military and intelligence operatives, this is National Review Online, our military and intelligence operatives make the occasional horrific mistake, but we are not the sort of people who would, for example, massacre school children with malice aforethought in order to achieve our policy objectives. In the Islamic world, our opponents are, in fact, such people. It is not that they have no moral code. They have a moral code that excludes us. Al-Qaeda et al. View the West not as a competitor, but as a contagion. Perhaps there is something to be learned from that view, namely that the democracy project having failed, our best strategy is a quarantine. He's exactly right. We need to start thinking of Islam as a contagion, and what you do with a contagious disease is you quarantine it. Middle Eastern occupations are not going to prevent another 9/11, but border control and immigration reform would go a long way toward achieving that. Visitors who are coming from jihadist hotspots or who have some connection with them should be subject to an extraordinary degree of scrutiny and supervision. Student visas in particular should be severely restricted. Beyond that, immigration from the Middle East to the United States should be radically curtailed. That such actions would unfairly burden some citizens of those countries should be considered at most secondary to the fact that they would protect citizens of this country. So another voice joining me. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a contagion that must be contained, must be quarantined. Not every Muslim represents a threat to the United States. I admit that. I've said that every time we've talked about it. But we don't know the good guys from the bad guys until that day comes. I believe we need to suspend Islamic immigration. Kevin Williamson saying virtually the same thing. Focal Point and AFR Talk, back after the news.